Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to remind our listeners of the contest we launched to wrap up our first year of episodes. We want to showcase the up-and-coming ideas in the world of planning and design that will hopefully gain traction and make their way back onto our podcast as a book review episode. Are you going to be the person who comes up with a groundbreaking idea like new urbanism or form-based code? For more information on the contest, deadlines, and the prizes in the two categories, student and practicing professional, head to www.bookedonplanning.com/contest. This is Booked on Planning, a bi-weekly podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current and classic books. I'm Steph Rouse. This week, I'm joined by author Keith Bartholomew, who co-wrote Pedestrian and Transit-Oriented Design with Reed Ewing. Keith is an associate professor in the University of Utah's Department of City and Metropolitan Planning and is the associate dean of the College of Architecture and Planning. His primary research area is the development and application of integrated land-use transportation scenario analysis as the basis for community visioning, long-range transportation planning, and transportation project analysis.
This topic fascinated me from the very first days that I engaged in planning. I come to planning as a lawyer. My training was in environmental law, and I had the pleasure, the honor of working for a nonprofit organization in Portland, Oregon called 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And for your listeners who know 1,000 Friends, they are a fabulous nonprofit advocacy organization promoting smart growth and good planning throughout the state of Oregon. And that was my introduction to planning. And it was the second week on the job, and my supervising attorney plopped a big box, banker box, yes, this was pre-digital, of documents on my desk and said, they want to build a new freeway out in Washington County, and you're going to stop it. Okay, boss. And what ensued was about a decade of first litigation and then research on how to build a better suburb. And along the way, there was a lot of focus on transit and transit-oriented development, and we were dealing at a very large scale. Our study area was 100 square miles, and so things were moving around on maps at kind of a mega or a meta level, not at a micro level. But one of the things that I became sensitized to pretty quickly was that we were observing the aggregation of a lot of individuals making what to them were rational decisions about how to move around their communities, around their regions. And that those decisions were influenced by a number of rather kind of fine-grained nuances that had a lot to do with, not everything, but a lot to do with what they saw when they walked out the front door. When they're walking out that front door, are they reaching for the keys? Are they reaching for the bike helmet? Are they reaching for their bus pass? What are they going to choose based on what they see out that front door? And those kinds of factors are really so finely grained that you don't capture them in the kind of traditional planning lingo of density or mixed use or those kinds of rather large factored or structured levers. And so that got me thinking, okay, people are looking to see, is there a sidewalk? How wide is the sidewalk? Is it shaded? What does it go to? What does it go past? And they were making decisions, at least in part, based on those influences, because a lot of what we were dealing with in this proposed new freeway was we were dealing with people who owned cars and could use them. And so the question was not one of what do you do when you don't have a car? The question is, when you have a car, do you feel like you have to use it, or that you really want to use it, or that you are being told, maybe subtly, maybe not so, to get in the car because it's not pleasant out there? My own experience, being a hedonist as I am, is that people respond to what is pleasing to them. And if walking or biking or riding transit is not a pleasurable activity, and you are affluent enough to own a car and be able to afford to run it, by golly, that car feels pretty comfortable. And even if it is a later model vehicle, the seats, are pretty comfy. And depending on the investment you made in your sound system, you probably got good tunes. And so it beats a lot of street environments when it comes to creature comforts. So I thought, well, if we're going to win this freeway fight, we need to be promoting a built environment that is as comfortable, if not more comfortable, than the interior of a modern car. Not that they're equivalent, but we need to find some sort of analog so people say, yeah, I could drive, but it's so pleasant out there. And I hate traffic, because there are a lot of negatives with cars too, right? The congestion, having to deal with parking, and the cost of it. And so we're looking, how can we influence people's choice set when they're thinking about their different options for accomplishing their tasks during a day? How do we just very subtly get them to think about these other options and to consider them as being, real, live, possible options that they might actually choose, and then to take the next step to actually choose them? And we thought, well, we got to be working on pretty fine-grained urban design qualities if we want to do that.
In the book, you talk about how physical features, urban design, and then individual reactions are three broad categories that combine to create walkability, which influences whether or not someone wants to walk. I'm curious if each of these categories has an equal weight, or can one category, say the physical design of spaces, such as the sidewalk width, traffic volume, street canopy, and so on, create ideal conditions for walking without the other two?
The answer is both yes and no. How's that? I told you I was a lawyer. The problem with design and thinking about design and trying to operationalize design features into some sort of decision matrix is the natural human kind of engineer-oriented tendency to want to put numbers on things. And we want to justify the policy choices that we make based on data. And so show me that it matters, and then we will move forward with a policy to do that. And the matters part of that sentence means show me the numbers, show me the data. You can kind of do that with some other land use variables. Density is the one that is frequently used, and people have come up with good measures of land use mixing, what we call diversity. And that is pretty, accepted. The methodology for measuring that and then comparing that against travel behaviors is pretty well established. And so you can come up with some quantifiable numbers on that. Some other land use or geographic influences, such as we call it destination accessibility, but it's essentially proximity. How close you are to things, how close you are to concentrations of employment or cultural activities. We can show those numbers, and I think they're pretty convincing. But all of these are at a macro, or at least a mesoscale. And so the problem with design is that, as we've already defined it, design is down at a micro scale, and it is not as easy to aggregate the data and to ramp it up into a meaningful set of numbers, because it's a bunch of individual decisions being made in response to, multivarious influences. And so it's really hard to say, it's the sidewalks, or it's the street crossings, or it is the street-facing buildings, or it's the transparency of those buildings. The human tendency, I think this is an artifact of the Enlightenment era, of trying to create individual separated boxes for each factor and to study them in isolation of all other factors, kind of misses the point, because as I said before, we are dealing with people who are seeking to optimize their own pleasure, their own experience, and they're responding to a variety of different circumstances, they thankfully don't live in a laboratory. They live in a neighborhood. And those neighborhoods are, they're multifaceted and have all these different kinds of features. And so you can imagine, even if you put aside the fact that people are different, and so they will respond to different influences in different ways. Put aside that difficulty and you take the same person and plop them down into one environment where you've got great sidewalks, but the buildings are set back behind parking lots. How are they going to respond to that versus a place where the sidewalks are not so good, but all the buildings are street facing and are situated close to the street? How will they balance those different influences? And it's really hard to say, this is our silver bullet. This is the one thing. If you do this one thing, you will save your community. You will make your neighborhood, popular. You will get people to leave their cars at home and walk to their destinations. There's not a straight causal line that you can draw on this stuff. A lot of it is more art than science.
Yeah, that'd be far too easy, and I think would put a lot of us out of jobs if it was do these things and you'll have success. But I think your book does a good job of breaking these elements into 3 categories of essential, highly desirable, and worthwhile. So you can start to rank these different features of a good walkable, transit-friendly area and make decisions that way. And I'm curious, how do you determine which features belonged in which categories and how many of the features? Again, this is getting technical, and the answer is probably there really isn't one, of like how many features from each category do you need for a quality design space?
Well, I suppose I should start with a caveat that neither of the authors of this book are designers. So we're highly aware of the fact that we were a couple of outsiders walking into a field that is well defined by giants in that particular field who came before us. So in my case, I'm a lawyer and a planner, and my co-author, Reed Ewing, is an engineer and a planner. And so we were coming at this with humility, or we hope that comes through. That's what we intended to. But we wanted to know how can, understanding that it's difficult to effectively pull apart the strands of all these different features and to comprehend them individually or to prioritize them, and yet not everything changes at once. Both of us are students of political process. Reed having been a politician for a while. And so we understand that you can't just come in and say, okay, here's the program. We need to do all of this and we need to do it all now. That's just not how decisions are made in communities. They are made incrementally. And so we thought, well, let's not say that anything is not worthwhile, but maybe we could give a sequential list. Understanding that not everything's going to happen, not every policy is going to change all at once. If you were to prioritize certain policies, certain features to affect first, and then maybe a second wave later, and then maybe a third wave after that, how would you order this? And so that's what the book was constructed to do, is in a sense, it's really not a book about design. It's a book about policy and process. Again, understanding that this is, the sausage that goes into, whatever gets adopted as law or policy is happening in an environment, physical and political, that is always changing. I teach for a living, and one of the things I try to teach my students or remind them is don't think that what you see out the window right now will always be the way it is. This human tendency, we think, the way things are, well, it hasn't always been that way, because we have these old photographs that show us, what this corner used to look like. And so we know that things have changed over time. But somehow where we are today is permanent. And you have to stop and have, again, talk about humility. You have to, hey, you know what? What we see right now is not going to be the way it is in 10 years. That's a point of hope, I believe, because there's so many things that need to be better in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And to know and to, to think that it's not going to get any better than this is kind of a dismal thought. But the idea is, oh, well, okay, we're on a path. And we hope that's a positive path. It's an upward flowing arc, we hope, and that it will continue to get better. And my job while I'm here and still active and have energy is to push the cart just that much up the hill, and then hopefully somebody will come in behind me and pick up the work after that. So just trying to make that incremental change, make things just a little bit better, to, as John Wesley said, to do the good that we can. And so that's what this book is trying to do, is to provide some insight into, okay, if you can't do everything, focus on this for a while.
That's a really good point. I like the incremental change, and because it can day to day seem like we're just hitting walls and nothing's going to change. But I grew up in Lincoln, and then I moved away for 5 or 6 years, and then coming back, a whole new district had sprung up and is a really great attraction for the city. And having been removed from it, it seemed like it changed pretty quickly, but I'm sure the planners that were working on it day to day to get the railroad moved, to get the developers on board, all of that just took a long time and probably seemed very incremental. So if a community is missing a key element like density near transit stops or doesn't have shorter block lengths, what strategies can be employed to improve conditions to support greater pedestrian and transit activity? Or is it just a matter of going back to the policy of setting the right zoning regulations into place and then waiting for development to happen?
Well, it's probably a multifaceted approach, because I think planners work their best when they find little niches of opportunity. If you are considering the development fringe of a community, the edge where the greenfields are being transitioned into new communities, new neighborhoods, that's a different approach and a different attitude to policy compared to the redevelopment of an inner city block, the revitalization of a neighborhood that maybe has very large streets and very large blocks, and those are already set in place. And how are you going to change those? You're not going to come in, hopefully, and obliterate the whole neighborhood and start from clean ground. I don't think we do much of that anymore, thankfully. And so the question is, how, if you're in that latter situation, where are those very small kind of incremental changes or opportunities that you can move things forward in just a small way? I moved here to Salt Lake City from Portland, Oregon. In other words, I went from the place with the really small blocks to the place with the really big blocks. I mean, it's really from one end of the spectrum to the other. You can fit 9 Portland-sized city blocks and their streets on a single Salt Lake City block.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. And the street sizes and the street widths are proportional to each situation. So Portland, because they have these tiny blocks, can have, 2-lane streets. They're very tight curb to curb distances. And that means that the street wall on each side of the block is also very tight, which provides a great enclosure and a lot of other great urban design qualities. That's why Portland gets its reputation as such a pedestrian-oriented city. And Salt Lake, because it has so few streets, the streets have to be very wide to accommodate the traffic. And so the streets in Salt Lake are, 4, 5, 6 lanes wide, 132 feet from curb to curb in most cases. And so that means that crossing distances are huge. It means that traffic volume and traffic speeds are both very high. Then those are, intimidating to pedestrians and discouraging of pedestrian movement. And so there are a lot of people who just look at our situation and throw up their hands and say, it's, the cake is baked. You can't do anything about this. We're not going to go out there and rip these blocks up and rip these streets up. Or are we? And that's, thankfully, we've had some really creative planners and political leaders that have questioned that sense of futility. We haven't figured everything out, but we have taken I think, some strategic advantage of what ends up being a huge public resource. I mean, that's a big right of way. It's all publicly owned. In many cases, it's being used for automobile movement and storage, but it doesn't have to be. We've got authority and ownership of the street. We could do something different with it. And so in some cases, our city has done that. So we have 300 South, sometimes called Broadway, now has middle of the street parking. I know we're not the only place in the world that has that, but it's not common. It was introduced about 15 years ago, maybe 20, and it was radical, revolutionary. There were a lot of people grumbling about it. Our mayor was into it, and people were like, there were a lot of reasons why people didn't like that mayor, and this was just another one. But it was brilliant. He'd seen it someplace, and he brought it home, and he said, let's try this. And they went out and just spray painted the parking lines in the middle of the street. And what it did is it took what was a 5-lane street and took it down to 2 travel lanes with diagonal parking on both sides of each lane, and effectively narrowed the lanes, which we know is an effective way to reduce traffic speed and traffic volume. And it created a lot of on-street parking, which local independent businesses love. And so it was a pro-business, pro-small business policy that helped to support the businesses that line that street. And of course, having active, successful small businesses along this street also helps make it pedestrian friendly. It was just lines and orange cones for a couple of years. And then they went back and got the budget and put in the curbs. And so now there are medians, and they are planted medians. And we've now got our bike share stations on those medians, along with the parking, and there are trees, street trees that are growing up, and they're now maturing and starting to provide some shade. And so this hideous looking gash of a street is now becoming this kind of haven. Yeah, there's still some people who grumble about driving along that street. And it's like, oh, well, maybe you should drive on another street. They won't miss you.
Open up the traffic a little more.
Yeah, and so we've also, these wide streets have also given us the opportunity for putting in protected bike lanes. It's small, but a growing network of protected bike lanes on these streets because we've got all this right of way. We're known for our light rail investments over the past couple of decades. We now have, I think region-wide, we now have 176 miles of rail transit. And in 1999, we had 0. A chunk of that is commuter rail, but a bunch of it's light rail. And putting light rail down a street that's 132 feet wide, well, that's not as hard as it is in Portland. That's difficult. Putting light rail down a Portland street is tough. For us, we got it. We can use it.
Yeah, I wish I had that problem. Trying to get bike lanes in, you're taking out valuable vehicle travel lanes. So there's always controversy there. So sticking with the street grid network, for pedestrians, the shortest path is always most desirable. And when you have a very gridded network, it's easy to take the shortest path and have a quick trip. But in the book, it also points out some of the drawbacks is if you're going to build a gridded network, you're probably not taking into consideration the natural topography, and also that a curving pattern does more to create a sense of enclosure. So I'm curious how you balance these two approaches to create kind of the ideal situation.
Yeah, well, being in the West, as we both are, we are the beneficiaries of the township range survey system that laid out these lands starting in the early 19th century. Our fellow planners in eastern cities don't have as much of a challenge on this, but out West here, yeah, everything follows the grid. It's pretty relentless. And it is really strong for things like legibility and coherence. I mean, these are urban design qualities that Kevin Lynch talks about. And with a grid, you can easily conceptualize where you are in space. And then that's what people seek to do. People, when they're out moving around town, they are frequently needing reassurance of where they are and where they're going. Now, GPS provides that for us in ways that are different from the past, but people are constantly looking for a map with an arrow, a "you are here" arrow. That's you want to know, I am here, and this is where I am. This is now I know I am situated, and I know where I'm going. And in other words, I'm not lost. And the gridded street system is fantastic for that. And if you take it to the kind of the next level, like our European pioneer ancestors did in Salt Lake, so you'll use street names that use numbers that all orient towards a certain geopoint on the landscape. And so you'll know exactly, oh, my address is 115 South, 1100 East. So I know that I'm 11 blocks east of that geopoint, and I am 1.5 blocks south of it. So it's so easy to find your way. The difficulty with this system is, as you pointed out, it's not very observant of topography. Sam Warner Bass, the historian, once said that San Francisco was a demonstration of the abstract over the particular. He was referring to the streets in San Francisco that also follow a grid. There are two different grids there, but they're both grids. They don't care about Nob Hill or Russian Hill or any of the hills. We're just going up that hill, by golly, and that's not very respectful of the environment and creates some negative consequences, both natural and human. And now we're learning that this is a study that just came out in the last 6 months, that people who grow up in gridded street environments have an impeded ability, a lower ability, cognitive ability to find their way when they are in unfamiliar environments. In other words, they are more easily lost. So you pick somebody up that's grown up in one of our towns in Lincoln or in Salt Lake City, and they know the grid and they are familiar with the grid, and you plop them down in, medieval Rome, and they can't find their way because the streets don't follow the grid. They go all over higgledy-piggledy. And conversely, the people who grow up in places where the streets are not on a grid are much better at being able to find their way in unfamiliar environments, even when the streets go every which way. It turns out that the grid has affected human cognition in ways that, I don't know if that's good or bad. I guess, you don't necessarily have to put a normative value on it, but I guess the grid is kind of, it's the 19th century GPS, impeding our future generations' ability to understand space. I mean, there are other things with the grid. If you go downtown Salt Lake City to State Street, which is our principal north-south arterial, and you look north, you will see capping at the end of the street, the state capitol. So, it's at the top of the hill, and it is a grand neoclassical structure. And you'll say, oh, okay, that's impressive. And then you turn around and you look to the south, and you see, oh my gosh, that street goes on forever. Am I seeing Mexico down there? It just seems like there is no end to that horizon. And it's a disconcerting experience. It compromises a sense of enclosure, it compromises this sense of being kind of tucked into your neighborhood, which is what people want. It's one of those urban design qualities, that sense of, not being the tallest thing on the landscape. And the grids, if they're not mitigated or truncated, they just go on forever. We have that experience looking to the west also. It's like, oh my gosh, I think I see Reno. Is that Reno over there? So grids are problematic. I think where we are on gridded streets is that a modified grid is probably the sweet spot between coherence, legibility, respect for topography, and a sense of terminated vistas, a sense that, it doesn't go on forever, that there is a sense of enclosure and a sense of kind of beckoning around the corner. I mean, that's something that the landscape architects taught us is, you want to lead people down a path, down a street. And one of the ways you do that is you don't show them everything at once. You just provide just a sequential series of vistas And that will raise some curiosity, some interest. Oh, I wonder what's around that corner. And that kind of leads people through an environment in a way where they're entertained, bemused, and find something rewarding around the corner, we hope.
Yeah, that's interesting. Lincoln's very much a grid system, and one of their early approaches was to plop the state capitol right in the middle of the grid. So there's streets from all directions that dead end into the middle of the capitol. It does a good job of terminating the vistas and breaking the grid up a bit, but if you're trying to go in a straight line, you have to go half a block out of your way, down half a block back.
Like in Annapolis, where the state capitol is, there's a curvilinear street that goes around the state capitol, but the axes all kind of point to the state capitol. I wish we had done that with our city hall. We have a neo-Richardsonian Romanesque building that is our city hall, and there are no gargoyles on it, but it kind of looks like it could have gargoyles on it. It's certainly historical and monumental, and has a high degree of imageability, which is another one of those urban design qualities. And unfortunately, it's not in the middle of the street like the state capitol is. If they had shifted City Hall half a block over so that it was in the way and people did have to go around it, then it would create a higher degree of imageability. It would kind of truncate that vista a little bit, terminate it, and kind of tuck in the downtown. I think it would have improved things. But that building's been there since 1870s, 1880s. I don't think they're going to move it.
And a lot has changed in the last century, and even in the last 10 or so years since the original book was published. And I'm curious if you've seen any policies related to this field that have changed that may impact if you were to do an update on the book.
Well, sure. I mean, like that research on cognition, I think is really interesting. And we want to put something in there about that and talk about, okay, what's going on with the grid now? And where is practice headed on the laying out of streets? Understanding that the laying out of streets at the kind of scale that we're talking about is generally a practice that is only experienced during greenfield development or large-scale redevelopments. We're right now in the process of redeveloping our former state prison site. And so that's a large infill and redevelopment site in the center of our valley, southern end. But I mean, it's surrounded by a lot of development. And so that is an opportunity to come in with a kind of fresh look at how the streets work. Those are so few and far between. So I don't know how much that is going to affect things. I guess this is a kind of a political statement as much of anything, but the older I get, the more I'm convinced Jane Jacobs was right, that places that matter grow organically, incrementally. They don't all come out of the box at the same time, ready to be set up like Ikea furniture. And so meaningful change is small change. And I know that's frustrating for people. And when I was younger and less patient, that was not something I wanted to spend much time with, because I wanted big change. I wanted to see that meter move, and otherwise it wasn't worth my time. And now I realize, no, the things that really matter are those small things. So that's what I would want to work on if I were to not even rewrite the book. I think it would be a new book. I think it would build off of this, and it would be, okay, how do we look at these same issues and these same features at the incremental scale, just very small infill redevelopment kind of context, and where do we learn about practice going forward, understanding that every one of these situations is built off of a set of circumstances that are not replicable. That is probably the biggest takeaway from my experience with design, is that you find the situation that you have, and that there will be a series of challenges and opportunities endemic to that situation, and you strategize to get the best outcome you can given those circumstances. And no cookie cutter, no list of prescriptions from so-called experts and other places are going to be able to fully advise you on what to do. That freeway I mentioned in Washington County, we did win that fight, and the good people of the Portland region are still winning that fight because it doesn't go away. It's like a bad penny proposal for a freeway. They keep bringing it back about once a decade. There's another proposal for the same gosh darn thing, and they keep thankfully saying no to it. But when I moved here to Salt Lake 25 years ago, that's amazing. There was a proposal for a new freeway, and some people in the activist community knew of my history with the situation in Portland, and they were all very excited. Oh, great, here's someone who knows how to do it. And I was very disappointing to them because I said, no, I knew my situation in Portland. I knew where the levers were. I knew where the opportunities were, where the vulnerabilities were, what the messaging would have to be. And I can't pretend to know any of that. I'm a newcomer. I'm a carpetbagger. And for me to come in and just say, oh, well, this is what you need to do is ostentatious, arrogant, and also not effective. Activism happens one person at a time, one situation at a time. So that's also true with urban design. One of the things I was thinking about before our call today was an aphorism, and I tried to source it, and your listeners will be able to help, I'm sure. I think it's from Alan Jacobs, the great planner from the Bay Area, who wrote the book Great Streets, among other books. And I think it was he who said that buildings come and go, but streets are forever. And, I think one of the things I would want to do with a new book would be to focus on that aphorism, to test it, first of all, but also to help inform it. Because for years, for decades, as a planner, I thought, well, that means, okay, if we don't get the streets right when they go in, it is what it is, and we just got to deal with it. And I've come to understand that, as I was saying in my example about 300 South in Salt Lake City, that actually these are pretty malleable spaces. And I think the pandemic really taught us that, with the living streets. Do you call it a movement, a trend of pedestrians and bicyclists and non-motorized users taking over streets, sometimes permanently? I think people are coming to understand, okay, that these are really malleable spaces and they're public resources. They are, in most cities, the biggest chunk of publicly owned land, and we can do different things with them. We are not bound by some mid-20th century vision of what streets are and can be.
I always think of Times Square in New York, very large street that they've reclaimed and is now an incredible space for pedestrians. And it wasn't an over the night, let's do some big construction project. It was, let's put some cones up, grab some really cheap chairs and see how this goes. And it was a success. And then they did the expensive permanent solution. So it can be challenging to make the case, but I definitely think that they can change. Are there any communities that you think do a really good job with pedestrian and transit-oriented design, or neighborhoods and communities that would be great for planners to look towards? I guess we talked about how Portland is kind of the poster child for that, but if there's others out there that you think would be good examples to look at?
Like a lot of Americans, my examples are all in Europe, and so I'm not sure that that's really helpful. Where I look for inspiration is in places that have changed recently. And because of my interest in incremental change, and generally looking in spaces of transformation, redevelopment, yes, but also just kind of small scale changes that are helping to create just a little bit better pedestrian environment. And those are too numerous to list. It's not like one district where you can say, go to this neighborhood and you will learn everything you need to know about this. I'd say look around your community to the places where you think something's working and ask yourself, why is it working? I mean, when I say working for non-auto modes of transportation, for people who are navigating through an environment without a car. What is it about what you're seeing that seems to support that seems to endorse that, encourage that? And what is it that specifically is having that effect? Is this something new? Is this something old? How would you help to foster at least an analogous if not cookie cutter, replication of that feature in some other place? And then how would you express this in policy? If you wanted to see that kind of effect in other places, what would you change in your zoning ordinance or your capital improvement program to seek out just a little bit of a change? And this is the approach that David Sucher from Seattle uses so well in his book, now a series of books on city comforts. And according to his own story at the beginning of his book, he came to the City Planning Commission and they were all arguing about words. Should we use this word in the zoning ordinance or this word? And he was more about images. It was like, well, what works? What doesn't work? Let's go out with cameras and take photographs and then look at the photographs and try to analyze, maybe reverse engineer what we're seeing. And then let's start talking about how do you translate what you're seeing and what seems to be working or not working, and how does that get translated into policy. And I think, there are examples of good and bad endeavors or environments in every community. And I think it's, mainly up to people where they are to find where those places are and to say, that's cool. That corner right there works. How do we make another one of those in another set of circumstances? How do we put that into our street standards? How do we put it into our next capital improvement budget? And maybe how does that go into the zoning ordinance?
I think that's really great because finding areas in your own community, I think, is going to be a lot easier to replicate and get buy-in. You want to do more bike infrastructure and we want to get people on active modes of transportation. And then you get we're not Amsterdam, or stop pointing to places in Europe. We're not Europe. And so by saying it's working here in this part of our town, let's replicate and get it to work here as well, is going to be a lot easier to get more buy-in.
And then there's that, Portland fatigue. I hear a lot of that.
Yeah.
Stop talking about Portland.
Well, to wrap up our conversation, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to summarize, or if there's the most important thing that listeners should take away from this conversation or the book, what would that be?
Yeah, I'll leave with something that didn't make the final edit. And I don't know why it didn't. I became aware as I was working on this book of how other cultures reference urban design qualities that we were addressing in the book. Because I thought, this is all very European and predominantly white in its influence and Anglo. And I thought English planning tradition is a great one. It's a fine one. The Town and Country Planning Act is a paragon of good practice. And there are lots of other examples and there's lots of other wisdom in the world. And so how is it that other places and other cultures understand some of these issues and see them differently and express them differently? And it's on this latter issue of expression or communication that I want to focus. I have a planner friend who is Latino, and I was talking with him about something having to do with the feature that we talk about in the book of having street-facing buildings. In other words, having buildings that front onto a sidewalk and a street as opposed to a parking lot. But he used a phrase, a Spanish phrase, and he just kind of tossed it off like it was, this is how we talk about that in Latino cultures. I know enough, knowing some Italian, I thought, the verb he just used, I said, is that the verb for to give? And he said, yeah, that's the Spanish verb for to give. And that's how they refer to a building that fronts on a street is a building that gives to the street. And I thought that is perfect. That encapsulates, I think, the ethic of what we're after with good urban design is we want to have a built environment that gives to the community, that gives to the street. And by giving to the street, we're not just talking about giving to that particular piece of asphalt and right of way, but giving to the street life, to the life that happens on the street. How is this building contributing to that life that happens on the street? And it got me thinking about, this is really when we're talking about urban design, we're really talking about hospitality. If we want to encourage people to use this space, to inhabit this space, to enliven this space, we need to invite them. And how do we do that? Through policy, through infrastructure, through investment, through development, how do we effectively, analogously send them an invitation to come, inhabit this place, make yourself comfortable, make it your own, and give to your community by doing that. And I think that's what planning is. Good planning is basically you're in the hospitality business. And I think if you just have that ethic and that approach, all the details will come after that.
I think that's a really great way to summarize the conversation. And I really enjoyed our talk and want to thank you again for coming on the podcast today.
Well, it's been fun, Stephanie. Thank you so much. And I hope the rest of your summer is a little bit cooler than it has been.
Thanks. You as well.